When World War II ended, the world demanded justice. We got the Nuremberg trials, the manhunts, the stories of high-ranking Nazis facing the hangman. We have this idea that the scales were balanced, but that's a dangerously incomplete picture. For some of the most complicit figures of the Third Reich, justice was a complete joke. Case in point, one woman married to a chief architect of the Holocaust decided the new German government owed her money. I'm not kidding. She launched a decade-long lawsuit to get her dead husband's state pension paid out. And that's not even the most infuriating story we're covering. We're going to expose the fanatical wife who wanted her husband to have children with his mistress to serve the Reich, and the celebrity pilot who remained a devoted Hitler fan and still got an invitation to the White House. The story of the Nazi wives is the ultimate story of justice denied. So let's kick it off with that unbelievable lawsuit, a tale that will make your blood boil. This is the story of Lena Heydrich, the wife of a man so evil that even Hitler called him the man with the iron heart. Her husband was Reinhard Heydrich, a primary architect of the Holocaust and the Butcher of Prague. He was the monster's monster. After he was assassinated by Czech resistance fighters in 1942, he was given a lavish state funeral, hailed as a Nazi martyr. Lena played the part of the grieving widow perfectly. She received a massive pension from the SS, lived in a castle, and enjoyed the spoils of her husband's reign of terror. But then, of course, Germany lost the war, and as the Allies rolled in, Lena had to face the music. Or so you'd think. She was arrested and tried, but here's where the story takes a truly bizarre turn. The court couldn't definitively prove she was a major Nazi figure herself, despite her unrepentant views and deep connections. She was essentially let go. But that wasn't enough for Lena. Oh no. See, her massive Nazi pension had been cut off, and she wanted it back. So in an act of breathtaking nerve, Lena Heydrich sued the new West German government. Her argument was that her husband was a German general who died in the line of duty, and therefore as his widow, she was legally entitled to his state pension. She spent years, a decade in fact, fighting this in court. The German government understandably argued that paying a pension for one of the worst war criminals in human history was insane. But Lena was relentless. She painted herself and her husband as victims, people who had simply been caught up in the politics of the time. She claimed Reinhard was just a man who had been unfairly demonized. And in 1958, she won. The German court sided with her, and she was granted the full pension of a high-ranking general, which she collected for the rest of her life. She even ran her husband's old castle as a restaurant and inn, which became a reunion spot for former SS members. She died in 1985, a wealthy woman, having successfully milked the system she helped create, and then the one that replaced it. But as infuriating as that is, it is nothing compared to what's coming later. I'm serious, stick around because we are going to expose the wife of the single most evil man in the entire Nazi regime besides Hitler himself, Heinrich Himmler. And when you hear how she played the system and walked away almost scot-free, it will make your blood boil. Now, from a story of legal absurdity, let's turn to one of social downfall. Meet Emmy Goering, the wife of the flamboyant, art-thieving head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Goering. Before the war, Emmy was a famous and beloved actress. When she married Goering, she became the unofficial First Lady of the Third Reich, a title that deeply annoyed Eva Braun. Emmy lived a life of pure fantasy. She hosted lavish parties at their estate Karen Hall, which was practically a private kingdom filled with stolen art treasures. She dripped with jewels and furs, embodying the corrupt excess of the Nazi elite. In her mind, she wasn't a villain at all. She was simply a gracious hostess and a patron of the arts. But when the Reich collapsed, so did her world. Emmy was arrested by the Allies, not for any specific crime, but simply for being Frau Goering. She was shocked, utterly bewildered that anyone could see her as anything other than a victim, and you'd have to be just as bewildered to not be subscribed for more insane true stories like this. She spent time in an internment camp, and the experience broke her. The famous actress who once commanded stages was now just another prisoner. After her release, she was destitute. All the stolen art, the mansions, the jewels, gone. She spent the rest of her life defending her husband's legacy, writing a book that painted him as a loving patriot. It's a pathetic end for a woman who lives so high on the blood money of the regime. But if you think that's a sad story of a woman clinging to her husband's legacy, you haven't heard about Gerda Bormann. Her husband was Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary and the shadowy, bureaucratic spider at the center of the Nazi web of power. And if Martin was a fanatical Nazi, Gerda was on a whole other level. Her involvement went way beyond simple complicity. She was a true believer in the most extreme sense. Gerda was a Nazi supermom, having 10 children and espousing the view that the ideal German woman's purpose was to breed for the Reich. She was so fanatically devoted to this idea that her personal life became a twisted embodiment of Nazi ideology. She knew her husband was having a long-term affair with an actress. But was she angry? Did she feel betrayed? Nope. Instead, Gerda Bormann wrote to her husband and proposed a solution. She suggested that he should have children with his mistress and that those children could be raised by her alongside her own. Why? Because the Reich needed more racially valuable children, and it was their duty to produce them, even if it meant creating a bizarre, state-sanctioned polygamous family. She went far beyond just turning a blind eye. She was actively encouraging infidelity and framing it as a patriotic duty. It's a level of brainwashing that is genuinely hard to comprehend. Her end was just as grim. In 1945, with her husband having vanished during the fall of Berlin, Gerda fled with her children to South Tyrol, Italy. There, she was diagnosed with advanced uterine cancer. The doctors treated her with mercury, which was a common but toxic treatment at the time. She died in agony from mercury poisoning in 1946. A fanatical believer to the very end, dying in a foreign land as the ideology she dedicated her life to lay in ruins. But what about a woman who dedicates her entire life to a delusion? The story of Ilse Hess takes a hard right turn into the bizarre world of post-war revisionism. Her husband was Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy Führer, famous for his bizarre solo flight to Scotland in 1941 in a misguided attempt to broker peace. For this, he was imprisoned for life in Spandau prison, where he became its sole inmate for the last 20 years of his life. Ilse, however, never accepted this reality. In her eyes, Rudolf wasn't the high-ranking Nazi who helped build a murderous regime. Instead, he was a misunderstood hero, a martyr for peace. For the next 4 decades, she dedicated her entire existence to a single cause: freeing her husband. She launched a relentless public relations campaign. She gave interviews, wrote letters, and published a book titled England's Justice, all arguing that her husband's imprisonment was a grave injustice. She became a figurehead for a network of Nazi sympathizers and revisionists who sought to rewrite history. Ilse's denial was absolute. She ignored his complicity in the early Nazi laws, his fanatic devotion to Hitler, and portrayed him as a man who only ever wanted peace. She died in 1995, 8 years after her husband committed suicide in prison, having never once wavered from her completely fabricated version of reality. But not every wife was a sycophant or a true believer. In fact, one of them did the unthinkable. She actually stood up to Adolf Hitler, to his face. This is the story of Henriette von Schirach. Henriette was, for a time, the ultimate insider. Her father was Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's personal photographer and close friend. She grew up in Hitler's inner circle and eventually married Baldur von Schirach, the fanatical leader of the Hitler Youth. For years, Henriette lived a life of privilege and influence. She was a welcome guest at Hitler's mountain retreat, but she was also different. She had a conscience that, unlike others, wasn't entirely numb. In 1943, during a visit to the Netherlands, she witnessed firsthand the brutal and public roundup of Jewish women. She was horrified. So the next time she saw Hitler, she did something no one else dared to do. During a dinner conversation, she confronted him directly, telling him what she had seen in Amsterdam and questioning the persecution of the Jews. The room went silent. Hitler, who was used to nothing but fawning adoration, flew into a rage. He reportedly screamed at her, "You are sentimental," and told her she knew nothing of what was happening. He dismissed her and told her to leave. It was the end of their relationship. The Schirachs were cast out of the inner circle, and her husband was effectively exiled to a post in Vienna. After the war, Baldur von Schirach was tried at Nuremberg and sentenced to 20 years in prison. And here's another twist. While he was in prison, Henriette divorced him. She claimed she couldn't stay married to a man responsible for deporting tens of thousands of Jews from Vienna. While her one moment of bravery is notable, it's a complicated legacy. She still spent years enjoying the perks of the system before her conscience finally kicked in. She later worked as a writer, but her one act of defiance against the Führer would define her strange and contradictory life. Now, some of these women are infamous for what they did in life, but one is famous for what happened to her after she died. Karen Göring was Hermann Göring's first wife, and he was utterly obsessed with her. She was a Swedish aristocrat who died of heart failure in 1931, before the Nazis even took full power. But her death didn't end her story. Göring had her body exhumed from its grave in Sweden and brought to Germany. He then built a massive, opulent mausoleum for her at his Hall estate. It was a shrine. He would visit her tomb and speak to her as if she were still alive. But then, as the Red Army advanced in 1945, a terrified Göring dynamited the entire estate to keep it from falling into Soviet hands, including Karen's mausoleum. For years, her remains were thought to be lost. But in 1951, a magazine article led treasure hunters to the ruins, and they found a small zinc coffin containing her bones. The remains were sent back to Sweden and reburied. But the story doesn't even end there. In 1991, another group of treasure hunters found a different coffin, also claiming it held Karen's remains. For decades, nobody knew which was the real one. Finally, in 2012, DNA testing confirmed that the bones found in 1951 were indeed those of Karen Göring. It's a bizarre post-mortem journey for a woman who became a twisted symbol of her husband's obsession and vanity. Speaking of vanity, let's talk about Anneliese von Ribbentrop. Her husband, Joachim von Ribbentrop, was the Nazi foreign minister, a man known for his staggering arrogance and incompetence, and Anneliese was his perfect match. She was widely considered one of the most snobbish and disliked women in the Nazi elite. Her sense of superiority was legendary. She looked down on nearly everyone, including other high-ranking Nazi wives like Eva Braun, whom she considered a provincial nobody. This arrogance didn't fade after the war, not one bit. After her husband was tried at Nuremberg and hanged, Anneliese remained his most vocal and unrepentant defender. She showed absolutely no remorse for the regime's crimes. Instead, she spent her post-war years publishing books that tried to justify her husband's and Hitler's foreign policies. She argued that the war was forced upon Germany and that her husband was a misunderstood diplomat. She lived a long life, dying in 1973, having never once deviated from the belief that she and her husband were the victims, not the perpetrators. And now we must enter the darkest corner of this gallery of ghouls. What we're entering is a realm of pure, unadulterated sadism. She was the wife of Karl Otto Koch, the commandant of the Buchenwald and Majdanek concentration camps. And within these hells on earth, Ilse earned her nickname, the Bitch of Buchenwald. Survivors told stories of her cruelty that are hard to even stomach. They said she would ride her horse through the camp, whipping prisoners who displeased her. But the most infamous accusation, the one that cemented her place in history, was that she had a perverse fascination with the tattoos of prisoners. According to the legend, she would order prisoners with interesting tattoos to be murdered and skinned, so their skin could be used to make household items like book covers, gloves, and most famously, lampshades. After the war, she was put on trial. The lampshade story became a global sensation, a symbol of the ultimate Nazi depravity. But here's the thing, investigators could never definitively prove it. They found 2 shrunken heads, but no human skin lampshades. While there's no doubt she was a monster who delighted in cruelty, the most famous charge against her remains a grisly, unproven legend. She was sentenced to life in prison, then bizarrely released, then rearrested and tried by a German court after public outrage. This time, the life sentence stuck. In 1967, after decades in a Bavarian prison, she wrote a final delusional letter to her son, claiming she was a victim of injustice. Then, she tied several bedsheets together and hanged herself in her cell. A pathetic end for a woman who was a true monster, regardless of whether the lampshades were real or not. But what about the most famous wife of all, Eva Braun? The woman who spent 14 years as Hitler's secret girlfriend, only to finally marry him in the bunker just 40 hours before they both committed suicide. Her story seems to have a definitive end, but the story of her family and her image was just beginning. After the war, Eva's surviving family, her mother and her sisters, found themselves in a unique position. They were the relatives of the woman who had been closest to Hitler, and they cased in. Her sister Ilse got a hold of Eva's diaries and extensive personal photo albums and film reels. This was a treasure trove of intimate behind-the-scenes images of the Führer and his inner circle. They sold these images to publishers and filmmakers, helping to create a very specific and very misleading image of Eva. She was portrayed as a tragic, apolitical blonde who was just a girl in love, tragically caught up in events she didn't understand. The photo showed her laughing, swimming, and playing with her dogs. They created the myth of the good Nazi, the one who was just there for the party. This was a deliberate and profitable whitewashing of history. It completely ignored the fact that she lived a life of incredible luxury, fully aware of her partner's identity and power, and never once showed any sign of moral objection. The family profited by selling a lie, and for many people that sanitized, airbrushed version of Eva Braun is the one that persists today. And now, we arrive at the climax I promised you. The story that, for me, represents the ultimate failure of justice, the most infuriating post-war fate of all. This is the story of Margaret Himmler, the wife of the man whose name is synonymous with the Holocaust, SS Reichsfuhrer Heinrich Himmler. If her husband was the architect of the final solution, Margaret was the woman who managed his home life, funded by that very same mass murder. She was an early and ardent Nazi. She wasn't some naive bystander. She knew her husband's position and she enjoyed the immense status and wealth that came with it. She lived on a lavish estate, had access to servants, many of whom were slave laborers from concentration camps, and raised her daughter in a world built on unimaginable suffering. When the war ended and her husband committed suicide after being captured, Margaret was, of course, arrested. This, you would think, would be the start of a serious reckoning. She was the wife of the man who organized the SS, the Gestapo, and the entire network of death camps. Surely she would face severe consequences, but her defense was as simple as it was insulting. She claimed she knew nothing. Absolutely nothing. Margaret told interrogators that her husband never spoke about his work at home. She said the constant presence of high-ranking SS officers at her house was just normal social life. The phrase, "we knew nothing," became a common refrain for Germans after the war, but coming from the wife of Heinrich Himmler, it was a staggering, almost comical lie. And here's the punchline to this sick joke. The denazification courts, which were set up to purge Germany of Nazi influence, largely bought it. They investigated her for years, but in the end, their final verdict was an outrage. In 1953, they classified Marguerite Himmler as a mere Mitläufer, which means follower or fellow traveler. This was the second lowest category of complicity, essentially labeling her as a passive sympathizer with no real influence. It was a legal slap on the wrist. She was sentenced to 30 days of punitive work and lost her pension rights, but that was it. No major prison time, no real accountability. The wife of the man who murdered millions was officially deemed a minor offender. She lived out the rest of her days in Munich with her daughter, dying quietly in 1967, having faced almost no justice for her life at the heart of darkness. For our final story, we have something a little different. That is the ultimate failure of justice. This woman was never married to a top leader, yet she was more integral to the inner circle and more unrepentantly fanatical than almost anyone else. This is Hanna Reich, the most famous female aviator in Germany and Hitler's favorite pilot. Hanna was a superstar, a world-class test pilot who set records and was celebrated for her daring and skill. She was also a hardcore, ideologically pure Nazi. She adored Hitler and he adored her. She was one of the few women he treated as something of an equal, at least in her professional field. She was a regular at his side and a true believer in the cause. Her fanaticism was on full display in the final days of the war. In a move of sheer suicidal loyalty, she flew into the heart of a surrounded and bombarded Berlin to land a small plane near the Führer's bunker. Her goal was to rescue Hitler, though he refused to leave. She was one of the very last people to see him alive before he committed suicide. She wanted to die with him, but he ordered her to fly out and rally the German resistance. After the war, she was captured and interrogated, but here's where her story becomes a chilling lesson in how fame can wash away sin. Her status as a world-famous pilot largely overshadowed her Nazism. She was never seriously prosecuted. She went right back to her career in aviation. She continued to set records, became a celebrity in gliding, and founded a flying school in Ghana. And get this, in 1961, she was invited to the White House by President John F. Kennedy. The unrepentant Nazi fanatic who adored Hitler was shaking hands with the President of the United States. Throughout all this, she never once renounced her beliefs. In interviews late in her life, she spoke glowingly of Hitler, stating she would wear her Iron Cross with pride and that Germans should not feel shame. She died in 1979, a celebrated aviator, her deep, dark, and fanatical Nazism treated as little more than an eccentric footnote. So, from wives who sued for pensions to those who profited from lies, the fates of these women were as varied and unsettling as their lives. The denials of these women prove that reality can be easily twisted. But what happens when the actual, documented reality of the war is more unbelievable than any fiction you could write? Forget personal delusions. I'm talking about government-sanctioned plots and secret projects that sound like they were ripped from a comic book, but were 100% real. So click this video right here because the real stories of Nazi superweapons, secret spy plots, and a bizarre plan to make Hitler sound like a woman are way wilder than anything you can possibly imagine. Trust me, you need to see it to believe it.